Chapter 2, Sociological Research. In this chapter, we are going to discuss what is the scientific method, major research designs, ethics of research, feminist methodology, queer theory and methodology, and the data-rich future. What is a scientific method? Basically, it is a system that has you going through the steps to ensure objectivity and consistency while researching a problem. So the first step of the scientific method is to define the problem. Know exactly what the problem is, and you have to be clear and concise so you know what the exact issue is or question that you're looking at. Review the literature, so past literature on whatever topic you are choosing, to see what other people have written, to see what the limitations were, and to see what future research should be, because maybe that'll be where you want to central your research. And for step 3, formulate a testable hypothesis. So come up with an idea, a theory, or a hypothesis that can be testable. And after it's done, other people can test it also. So select the research design and then collect and analyze data. So think about the type of research you were doing and think about how you want to do it as far as methodology goes. Do you want to do surveys? Do you want to do phone calls? Do you want to do snowballing when it comes to sampling, where you have a person that you want to interview or a type of person dealing with a certain situation, and then you ask them for references and you go from there. So that would be snowballing. But there's different types of research designs and different types of sampling methods that you can use when it comes to your data. Also, you can include evaluation in the research design, different types of evaluations. And then for number 5, we have developing the conclusion. So a report is prepared and you will have an executive summary of everything that you have found, that you have studied. And it also includes the conclusion. So a conclusion is a summary of everything that you've already had. And if you want more information, that is on page 27 of your text. Figure 2-1 gives a visual of the scientific method. So for some people, instead of looking at words, visualizations are better for them to understand. So define the problem, review, formulate a hypothesis that is testable, select a research design, and with that, you are going to find a way to collect your data and collect your samples. Then you're going to have a conclusion and think of ideas of further research, and you would think about your limitations when it comes to that portion of your scientific method of your research design. Define the problem. So there are lots of problems you could think of in the world. You could think of issues with homelessness in Louisville specifically. You could maybe ask questions of where the people are going who are having their homes torn down in the West End as far as gentrification goes. There's a lot of things you can look up. The book has an example of looking at how school affects income or how it's related. But basically, you're going to have a problem that you're looking at, and you're going to have an exact way of defining it so you're able to assess or look at that concept or look at that situation. Reviewing the literature. So it's a very important part of the research process. It's important to know what other people have done when it comes to looking at a certain topic. So for instance, if you want to look at homelessness in Louisville, well, you can look at what other people have done when they were surveying or evaluating or trying to come up with a plan to help the homelessness in their city or their specific state. You just want to see what other people have done to see if you can apply it to Louisville specifically, if that's what you're looking at. And you want to make sure you don't do any of the mistakes they have done. And you can look at the limitations of their paper, which will be towards the end. And they'll say all the things that they did wrong, or if they had any biases, or if their sampling wasn't that good, or if they would have rather chosen a different methodology. So all of that would be in there. And if you look at a bunch of different research information pertaining to that, then you'll see what you shouldn't do. So over time, it's supposed to build up and make the research more refined and better over time. Formulating the hypothesis. So you're going to think about what do you want to look at, what do you want to study. So let's say statements about the relationship between two or more factors, and those factors are known as variables. So you can look at, a common one for psychology is to look at murder rates or crime rates and ice cream sales, because basically more people commit murder or crime in the summer because more people are out. And of course, in the summer, more people eat ice cream, so the sales go up. That would be a correlation, not a causation. So you know that they're related, and that would be a correlation, but you know also that ice cream sales don't cause people to murder or commit crime, so it's not a causation. But basically, you look at two things and try to come up with a statement about them. And then we have the variables. So those are traits or characteristics that would change under different conditions. So you might want to look at, as far as homelessness goes, if it's, snowing, where do the people go? What facilities or community programs are available to them? And then you could also look at later, what do homeless people do in the summer where the weather is better and they might actually be more comfortable outside, because we know with homeless facilities, they usually run out of space pretty quickly. So when looking at variables, you have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. So the independent variable is the variable that's hypothesized to cause or influence another. So in the homeless situation, it would be the weather. So what is affecting the homeless people would be whether it's hot or cold outside, and that would be the independent variable. The dependent variable would be the variable whose action depends on the influence of the independent variable. So it would be the homeless people. Where do they go? Do they go to a shelter? Do they try and couch surf with friends? Or do they find a place that's safe for them outside? So the homeless people would be the dependent variable in that situation. As mentioned in the previous slide, when it comes to formulating the hypothesis, think of causal logic or causation and correlation. So causal logic is where you have a relationship between a condition or a variable and a consequence. So you could say that maybe if someone is in a room that gets too hot and they're prone to seizures, that could be the cause that causes them to have an actual seizure in that moment. And a correlation would be, as I mentioned before, ice cream sales and crime rates going up. Collecting and analyzing data. So is it important to select the sample? So a sample is a representative from the larger population. So the small sample that you're going to study or interview or whatever it might be has to represent the larger population that you are looking at. And a random sample is when every member of an entire population being studied has the same chance of being selected. So everyone's selected randomly. You can pull straws. That way you can sample the people. But a sample, instead of a random sample, is more specific to the population that you want to study, and it could be generalizable. However, I'm not saying that a random sample is a wrong way of doing things. Sometimes it makes it better. Like maybe if you're studying people's attitudes toward a certain thing in Louisville, maybe when it comes to the elections, and you just want to see what's going on around Louisville, so that way you would just randomly interview people who are walking down a certain street. Snowball or convenient samples. So it's when you recruit a participant, as I mentioned before, and you interview them or they take a survey, and then you ask them if they know other people that's part of that community, especially if it's a sensitive community, like if you're studying transgender people and how doctors aren't fully open to dealing with them still in certain situations. So since they're a sensitive population, once you find someone who's transgender, you might be able to ask them, do they know of other people who will be interested in this study and helping out? And that way you're able to snowball or get convenient samples. It is important when it comes to collecting and analyzing your data that you are ensuring validity and reliability. So when something has validity, it is the degree to which a measure or scale truly reflects the phenomenon being studied. So basically, are you studying what you said you wanted to study? Like, does this reflect it? And for reliability, the extent to which a measure produces consistent results. So you studied a certain topic and you ended up with results. If you study it again, we end up with the same results. If other people study and follow your scientific method for your project, are they able to come up with the same results? Developing the conclusion. So we have supporting hypotheses. So psychological studies do not always generate data that support the original hypothesis, and that is okay. You might not have found what you were looking for, or your hypothesis might have been incorrect in a situation, and that's what you would state in the conclusion. So sociologists are interested in both the general pattern that emerges from data and exceptions to that pattern. So you might actually find something different or find the opposite of what you thought, and that is still okay. And it doesn't mean your project failed. It just means that you found evidence for a different hypothesis. Controlling for other factors. So you might have a control variable, and that variable held consistent in order to test the relative impact of an independent variable. So you might study, like when it comes to medications, you might have a group that receives a medication and a group that does not. So the group that does not would be considered their control group, and the group that does receive the medication would be the group that you're experimenting with, so your experimental group. And you would compare whatever happened to those that received the medication to those that did not receive the medication. So now we're going to go over an example of the scientific method. So their example is, does it pay to go to college? So we're going to think of education and earnings as far as income goes and educational levels. The hypothesis would be the higher one's educational degree, the more money one will earn. And of course, we know in all situations that's not true, but that is just the hypothesis of this person at the time. So they'll collect information from the Census Bureau since it tracks income levels, and their conclusion may be that people with more education or schooling do earn more money than others, although there are exceptions to the pattern, because we know that there are people that do not pursue higher education but still make a lot of money. So figure 2-2 shows educational level and household income in the United States. So the first map shows proportion of adults with college degrees, and then the second map shows how much money they make. So that you can see if people earn a lot of money, or sorry, if they have a lot of education, usually they have a lot of income. Usually, but not always. So as far as California, we see that there's a high educational attainment and that people earn high income. However, it is different for Alaska. They have a medium educational level, but they have high income there. And you will think about there's various reasons for that. So California is a place a lot of people would go and live at. However, Alaska, a lot of people aren't always going to flock to that state. So as you see, but for the most part, they do correlate. And you can't say that there is a causation when you compare the states. So if we look at Kentucky, we see that there's a low educational level, and then you can still see that there's low income when it comes to that. And it's the same for Indiana. Causal logic or causation, we'll see in figure 2-3. So we have the independent variable, which would be the level of educational degree, and the dependent variable would be the level of income. So basically they're showing with this one thing X, does it affect Y, or does it lead to Y? Also, we have the degree of lack of integration into a society and the likelihood of suicide. So you might think of people in the LGBTQ plus community, if they're not accepted, maybe the likelihood of suicide, or think of children that are being bullied and the likelihood of suicide. The availability of affordable housing and the level of homelessness, we do know that there is a correlation. Parents' church attendance correlates to how much the children go to church. Time spent preparing for a quiz and someone's performance on a quiz. The parents' income and the likelihood of kids enrolling in college. So we have X leading to Y, and it shows you the independent variable and dependent variable. On this figure 2-4, it shows the impact of a college education on income. So the first column has a high school diploma or less, and the second column has associate's degree or more. So you can compare people who make under $15,000. There's a larger percentage at 20% of those that make under $15,000 versus 11,000 of those with associate's degree. Or sorry, 11% of those with an associate's degree. And these are from 2015. And as you see, for those who make over $60,000, it's only 14% of those with a high school diploma or less. But with an associate's degree, it's 42%. So there is a difference of income and education levels. We are now going to go over major research designs, and we're going to go over surveys, ethnography, experiments, and existing sources. Surveys. So these could be an interview or a questionnaire that gives sociologists or any researcher information about how people think and act. So there's an interview, could be face-to-face, over the phone. It could be an online questionnaire. It could be recorded or just with someone taking notes. A questionnaire would be printed, or it actually could also be online or written, and you get information from a respondent that way. So an example of that would be the top reasons why men and women had sex, which people have studied. So in this table, it shows the top reasons why men and women had sex. So initially, the researchers asked 2,000 students, undergraduates at a University of Texas at Austin, why men and women had sex, and they list all those answers. So then, of course, they had a wide variety of answers, but the ones that they hear the most, they put on the survey and then gave it to a different group of students. And that different group of students were able to rate the top reasons why men and women had sex. So you see a lot of people say that they were attracted to the person. That was like the number one reason. But for number two, for men, it says it feels good. For women, it says they wanted to experience the physical pleasure. For men, other reasons would be they realized they were in love or was the heat of the moment. And for women, their higher reasons would be they wanted to achieve an orgasm and wanted to please their partner. So the number one reasons, though, would be that they were attracted to the other person for both. And also when it comes to interviews and surveys and things like that, you have to think about the interviewer. So a lot of the times when it comes to male researchers, they don't receive all of the answers, if that makes sense. So males would prefer to be interviewed by females. And they're actually more open to females. And then if the respondents or participants are Black, they're more likely to be open to someone that is non-white when it comes to their answers. And then also looking at this survey, just be aware that it's in a binary fashion as far as men and women. It's not including other people when it comes to this survey. So we have quantitative research and qualitative. Quantitative research is when you're dealing with numbers. So you have data primarily in numerical form, and then qualitative research relies on descriptions, actual interviews, verbatim words, quotes that people have said, but basically you are describing things in their natural setting, and you're only focusing on small groups and communities. So you can do more work with quantitative research. You can you could survey more people when it comes to that. However, if you want to add more to your data and actually bring the emotion into it or actual stories, then you would use qualitative research. Ethnography is a major form of research that a lot of people use. So it is studying a group of people or animals or whatever it may be in their social setting. And you're going to systematically view them, observe them. Sometimes people know you're there, sometimes they're aware of it, and sometimes they're not. It just depends on the type of ethnography you want to do. But observation is when you watch a group closely. So in ethnographic research, it also includes collecting historical information about a certain group of people, or even just that person's family, or their personal background, depending on what you're studying. And you'll also conduct in-person interviews, so they do know you're there, they do know why you're there. And you, of course, have to get permission to record and all of that, and you wouldn't use their specific names. Participant observation is a method in which a sociologist or any type of researcher joins a group for a period of time to get an accurate sense of how it operates. So the person might participate or just might watch a classroom interaction or watch the process of homeless people entering into a homeless shelter just to see how this program works. Experiment. So this is a situation that's created by the researcher to manipulate variables. So like I mentioned before, to give one group medication versus not giving another group the medication to compare. So you have your experimental group, which is exposed to the independent variable. So they'll be given the medication. The control group is not given the medication. And the Hawthorne effect is the unintended influence of observers of experimental subjects. So you might have heard of the Hawthorne effect when it comes to jobs. So if people know their boss is watching them, they work better, they work smarter, they work harder. Or even if you have your teacher watching you, or if you're watching your children, people tend to do better in that situation because someone is watching them. However, if you don't feel like someone's watching you, you might go back to your regular pace. And it doesn't mean that you're being bad or being deceitful. It's just that humans, we want to put our best foot forward. We want to look good. That's just what is in us innately as far as how we were born, how we were formed. So that's why we have the Hawthorne effect. You might have to take that into consideration as far as your limitations. If you are sitting in an area viewing something, people might be running their facility more correctly than they normally would. Use of existing sources. So sometimes it's easier to use existing sources, especially when it comes to tough research or sensitive groups. But you have secondary analysis. So it's a research technique that makes use of previously collected data. So it might be data from the Census Bureau, from the CDC, from the health department, and it's publicly accessible information. So it's not going to have anyone's personal information as far as names or identifiers. All that will be de-identified. Identifiers means like name, social, phone number, address, things like that. It's considered non-reactive because it's not influencing people's behavior. You're just studying data that's already out there. So how many people in Louisville have HIV, or how many people have heart disease or asthma in this city, you know, in 2020 compared to what it was in 2015 or 2010. So you could compare those things, and that would also consist of research. And then content analysis, so you can code and have objective data, and it gives you some rationale. So when you think of coding and objective data, that would be more so of qualitative research. Like you might get the same responses if you're interviewing people who are homeless and you're asking them, you know, tell me your experience or explain to me the difficulties you might face. You're just letting everyone talk. You might have emergent data, and those are the things that you're going to want to collect or pick out because you keep hearing it over and over and over from various people. So people usually will mention things like it is cold, in the winter, so that affects how they feel. They might mention the laws in the area as far as panhandling and what's allowed. They might mention that they've been removed from one location and have to go to another location and learn the area. They might mention lack of transportation, or maybe ending up in psychiatric wards or even jails. So whatever you keep hearing over and over and over from various people are the codes that are going to come up, and that's emergent data. And that is the data you're going to pay a lot of attention to when it comes to evaluating or analyzing or talking about the interviews you had with these people. So this table talks about existing sources. So they have frequently used sources. Some I've already mentioned, like the census, but they have marriage, divorce certificates, crime stats. And then other sources would be journals, diaries, articles, song lyrics, votes for elections, speeches that are public, literature, folklore, videos. There are a lot of things that you can look at for research. So table 2-3 compares the 4 major research designs that we've discussed. We have surveys, ethnography, experiment, existing sources / secondary analysis. So it gives you the advantages and disadvantages, which would be the limitations of each, and examples of these. So when you're ever trying to decide what you might want to use, this will be a good table to look at. And once you have an idea, then you can look at each specific slide or go to your book and get more information on it. Ethics, when it comes to research, is very, very important. You don't want to do anything that's going to harm your participants. So we have a code of ethics, and those are standards of acceptable behavior developed by and for members of a profession. So this is just for the American Sociological Association's Code of Ethics from 1997, but there are various types of code of ethics. Nurses have their own, physicians have their own, psychologists have their own. Schools usually have an IRB process that you go through. It's the Institutional Review Board. And basically, when you're going to do research with people, usually, you are going to submit what you plan on doing, and they're basically going to tell you if it's okay or not, or if you need to change something. And they do that because there's been a history of traumatic and abusive and experimental research done on people in this country, and we're trying to avoid that. Different types of experiments as far as testing on people's skin, telling them like it's perfume, but it's really not. It's actually different chemicals. As far as bioterrorism goes, or we've had people not be treated for syphilis, and we've had people get experimented on when it comes to giving birth and labor and all those things without anesthesia. So we've had people had their body parts removed and then sewed to another part of their body. We've had mind control things done where they give them different types of drugs and try and use mind control methods on them to see if it would work. So there's been a lot done in the history, and not just in the US, but in a lot of countries. So basically we have these codes of ethics to make sure people aren't being harmed. So you might even think of it in the fact of, like, if you wanted to study kids that were abused, well, if you were to interview those kids specifically, you would need permission from the children, of course, and then permission from their parents. And if you think about, a child can't give full permission, but you do want them to consent after their parents have said it's okay. However, most people aren't going to be okay with that because it's going to bring up trauma for the child, and then also for the parents, and it could bring up a lot of discord. So usually that's where the IRB, the Institutional Review Board, will step in and say, hey, you shouldn't interview the kids. Maybe look at adults who were abused as kids when they were younger, because as adults they can give their own consent and be hopefully in a better frame of mind than childhood in this situation. But we know it's not always true. Some people aren't over their trauma for various reasons, and then you'd have to have something to help them later, like counseling, debriefing. You can't just do an experiment on somebody, even if it's emotionally done, and then just leave them to deal with it, in shatters and pieces. So we have these ethics to make sure these things don't happen. Also, you want to make sure you're objective and have integrity. So you don't want to lie when it comes to your research. If you want certain results, you want to protect your subjects. You don't want to leak any of their information. So you want to think of confidentiality. You guys are nurses, so you know all about HIPAA. You basically want everyone to have an informed consent. They want to sign off on it. They need to know everything that you're going to do and why. You don't want to give out their financial information to other people. You want to de-identify anything, as I mentioned before, as far as their name, birth date, things like that. So if you're studying a sensitive group, say you want to study transgender people in Louisville. So instead of saying that for your research, you could say, I study transgender people in the Midwest. So that way it's not something that people can just point out, especially with sensitive groups that have HIV, groups that have been raped or endured domestic violence. You might want to even say, I studied people in, the East Coast, the eastern side of the U.S. So that way you're not giving away too much information so those people could be specifically found or found out about when it comes to certain situations. Also, you want to make sure that you're not placing your biases of the research or the situation on the people, on the participants, or on the data. Research might also have conflict of interest, and it's very important to think about these things, and usually the IRB catches that if you have access to one at your specific school. So money given in support of basic research can come with strings attached. So if a large pharmaceutical company wants you to do research, usually they want you to approve this drug or give evidence that the drug should be used in the public. So they might persuade you to writing data or writing an analysis or conclusion that supports the drug. So just think of that when you're involved in your career field later on when it comes to conflicts of interest. Value neutrality, and that's from Max Weber, and we do talk about him later on in this book. But basically he's saying that researchers or investigators have an ethical obligation to accept findings and research even if it doesn't support your original hypothesis, your original ideas or personal views. Even if it doesn't accept ideas that are widely accepted as far as society goes. Your data must speak to you, your data must speak, and you must report what your data has spoken. Feminist methodology. So it has a great impact on the current generation of researchers that we have now. So feminists talk more about work and family as far as being closely integrated. They talk about self-injury and being victimized, global research. They tend to involve and consult subjects more. As I mentioned before, people do speak to women more when it comes to interviews. Feminist methodology is more oriented towards social change, so changing things in society, making people aware of things, so public consciousness, and influencing or changing policy. And it's more open to a multidisciplinary approach, so they might want to use ideas from psychologists or ideas from the medical field. They don't just usually stick to just feminist methodology. They might want to use queer theory in there. They might want to use basic research methods. And there's different types as far as Weber and other sociologists and psychologists have gone, like Maslow, that they might want to incorporate into their research. Queer theory and methodology. So these theories challenge the sexual orientation generalizations that is in a lot of research. They talk about veiled reporting and a lot of issues people that are part of the group go through. So a lot of the research might just speak to HIV and AIDS later, but they don't speak to issues when it comes to employment, income. Are they able to get raises if someone finds out that they're LGBTQIA+, how they are in relationships, how people respond to them in relationships, how their family is dealt with or how their family deals with them. As far as even the media, how the media takes a lot of dances or phrases from the queer community without giving them credit. So there's a lot of things that they go through that aren't included in research, even dealing with how doctors perceive them or deal with them or want to even treat them, depending on which part of the queer group that they are in. So a lot of people feel like, well, where is the research that reflects me? Like, where is the research that, you know, talks about my issues or includes me in it? So if we think about when I said before the survey where it talked about men and women and their sexual encounter and the reason why they might have sex with someone, well, it only talked about male and female, so I called it binary, but there might be people who don't fit into that group. And then also when it comes to researchers, so I am in public health, and we're big on inclusivity, not just diversity. So we'll ask questions like, what pronouns do you want to be labeled with? And so for me, I would, if someone asked me that, I would say she, her, because that's how I want to be described. And then I would say that I'm a straight female, married, things like that, mother, whatever else they might want to ask me. But when it comes to interviewers, someone might be turned off, say if they're transgender and someone calls them by an incorrect pronoun, or if someone just says stuff like, you know, men and women as far as marriage goes, and, you know, these other people want to answer the questions, but they don't feel like it pertains to them, and they don't know if they should answer for themselves, you know, if they're lesbian, who would marry a woman instead of marrying a male, or they might not, they might want to give the answer that they think society wants to hear. So that will actually mess up your data. So just keep that in mind when it comes to queer theory or when you're surveying or investigating.